evening, everybody. First of all, it's fantastic to walk in the door and be completely stunned by how many people were sitting behind it. So that was a weird thing. So anybody who arrives late is going to have the same moment as they did when they came to the room. And it is, I mean, I'm not being glib, it is amazing to see so many people turn out, not least given the state of the weather and the traffic in getting here for a meeting this evening. It's hugely, hugely encouraging. But I suppose from our perspective it reflects what we've seen, particularly over the last 2 years, about not just an extensive support, but the depth of support that exists right across Ireland and right across Irish society for the repeal of the 8th Amendment and for the introduction of significantly significantly progressive laws on access to abortion here in Ireland. I should explain that Amnesty's entry into this area, obviously we're a human rights organisation, and what we're campaigning for is a legal framework in Ireland that doesn't just provide, minimum standards of regard or respect for women's rights here in Ireland. We're not talking about minimum standards, we don't think that's good enough at all, but rather a framework that protects, respects and fulfils women's human rights here in Ireland. When we carried out research, which we published in July of 2015, it was a report called She's Not a Criminal, and what we were doing there was identifying the range of violations, particularly grave human rights violations, that were the result of the 8th Amendment and Irish laws on abortion. And in that what we found was, unsurprisingly, the 8th Amendment is the root cause of those violations. And not just that it harms pregnant women and people by denying them access to abortion, but rather it severely limits, for instance, the right to informed consent, and I know we're going to hear more about that later on as well, and bodily autonomy throughout pregnancy and childbirth. So the 8th Amendment is an issue, absolutely, that we understand as being about access to abortion, but essentially its depth, its significance, the impact that it has, as I'm sure we'll hear from other speakers, is much, much deeper than that. We have in our Constitution and therefore on our statute books laws that gravely violate women's human rights, but that impact and affect every woman or girl, every person in this country who might become pregnant is directly impacted upon and is at risk because of the 8th Amendment. And that's an area that I think a campaign and the campaign needs to and will, of course, and many of our partners in this campaign are very focused on that, and that will be addressed in the coming period, I'm sure. One of the things that I suppose as we look forward to, I was talking to somebody earlier on and they went, we never would have imagined a few years ago that we'd be where we are now. And maybe that's a good moment to remind ourselves. Yes, there's a huge amount of work that we have left to do. That by no means can we take anything for granted about how this campaign will develop or where we'll get. And let's be clear about it. Repealing the 8th Amendment is an incredibly important step in ensuring that we have a legal framework in Ireland that fully respects and protects and fulfills women's rights. And it's the barrier that we have to get through in order to get there, but it's only one part of it. I think a few years ago nobody would have anticipated, and indeed before they made their recommendations, many didn't anticipate that the Citizens' Assembly, for instance, could have turned out to be such a huge and significant moment in both the conversation and, frankly, in the movement towards the repeal of the 8th Amendment and the enactment of the kind of legislation that we talked about. And it's really interesting to just reflect for a moment about what that process was. Very many of us were cynical about, and very many people were cynical about the decision of the government to put in place a Citizens' Assembly rather than to move to put in place a referendum and then repeal. Nevertheless, when it got up and running, I think many of us who are campaigning on this issue were really anxious to engage in that process in a way that presented the 99 citizens and the chair of the Assembly all of the evidence and information that would be necessary for them to come to really solid conclusions and recommendations. And their recommendations were hugely significant. Now, it was interesting to see many in the media reach for their smelling salts as soon as the recommendations were made public, as if somehow these 99 people had somehow lost the run of themselves in a hotel somewhere in North Dublin and didn't quite understand the nature of the real world. And actually, what that process showed, I think, is that when we sit down as people in Ireland, because that's where we are, but as people, and really engage with this issue from an objective perspective, where we consider the evidence, where we listen to discussion, where we listen absolutely most importantly of all to the lived experience of women, girls and pregnant people in this country whose rights have been so seriously impacted and so gravely violated as a result of our laws. And then we start to think about how do we provide a better framework. We come up with meaningful solutions. So the recommendation from the Assembly, for instance, that we should have access to abortion upon request up until 12 weeks without restriction as to reasons. Again, the smelling salts came into play in many of the commentators, not all, but many of the commentators when that came out. That was an extraordinarily reasoned recommendation on the part of the Assembly, because they heard all of the evidence about how well we could provide access, for instance, on what are called the minimum grounds, so cases of rape, incest, risk to health, and severe or fatal fetal abnormality. But all of the experience that we have internationally shows that even if that's the extent to which you would want to go on, we would not suggest that should be the limit by any means of where laws in Ireland should go. But even if you wanted to do that, you can't do that by providing laws that seek to restrict access and only allow them almost on an exception to criminal law around all of those criteria. So their very sensible recommendation about upon request in early pregnancy was based on the fact that we know that will provide meaningful access for the majority of people in this country who might choose to terminate a pregnancy or to seek an abortion in their individual circumstances. It was a really important recommendation. That's now, as you know, moving into the Oireachtas Committee. The Joint Oireachtas Committee meets for the first time tomorrow. I will put a call out to everybody in this room if you care about this issue. If you're in the constituency of a member of the committee, contact them. Let them know how you feel about the recommendations of the Assembly, and at the very least you'd like to see those move forward in terms of recommendations for legislation. But regardless of whether you have a member of the committee within your constituency, one of the things I think that many of us would give a call out for now is that we really need to start to engage members of the Oireachtas on moving forward on the basis of the recommendations of the Assembly at the very, very least. That's absolutely what we need to see happen now. And I suppose to be reasonable, we also need to give confidence to members of the Oireachtas who are concerned about how this might play out. It's really important that we counter the narrative that's out there that there isn't significant support for very far-reaching change to the regime for abortion here in Ireland, because there is. I mean, we carried out very extensive opinion polling over a 2-year period. We went into it with some assumptions about what we might find, and actually what we found challenged and set aside all of those assumptions. The level of consensus that exists across Irish society for very progressive change in this area is enormous. Like across every demographic, young, old, urban, rural, and all socioeconomic groups, there's overwhelming support for a framework that at the very least requires the repeal of the 8th Amendment and actually looks to go beyond that significantly. And that's both, right across the country. Interestingly, actually, in a shock to those of us who live in this part of the country, Munster is even more progressive than Dublin and the rest of Leinster on a number of the key issues. But across every age group, every socioeconomic group, every part of the country, there's significant support. And even, and this is, I think, a really important point to make, thank you, a really important point to make, and I'll move to finish within 2 minutes on this point. For once. A really important point to make is that we need to be very careful about making assumptions about where Irish people are at. If there's one thing the marriage equality referendum told us, it was that. Don't anybody dare to make assumptions about what we think about these issues that are about our lives and the lives of the people that we love and that we share our lives with, our families and our friends. Don't make those assumptions. But equally, let's not make assumptions based on people's personal positions, for instance, on abortion. One of the questions that we asked was, we wanted to find out how many people in Ireland were personally opposed to abortion in all circumstances. In the first round of polling that we did in 2015, it was 7%, and we were surprised it was that low. In 2016, it had gone down to 5%, which was interesting, because we assumed that people who hold that view are very rigid and very fixed in their view, and they're not going to be open to a conversation. We had all of those cliché views about that particular group of people, and we were wrong. Because in 2016, when we repeated the polling, we did much more in-depth analysis around varying perspectives, including, for instance, would you vote to repeal the 8th Amendment? And one of the really surprising outcomes of that poll was that half of that 5%, in other words, half of people who are personally opposed to abortion in all circumstances, even where the woman might die, would vote to repeal the 8th Amendment. Because their objection is personal, and they wouldn't impose it on other people through the force of law. That's a really interesting point. Half of those who might be seen as extreme in their pro-life position are in fact pro-choice. So I suppose my closing point would be, as we move forward in this conversation, we feel very strongly it's critically important that we take it away from the space that there'll be huge attempt constantly to deflect us into, a toxic space that seems to undermine
derail and intimidate the conversation that needs to follow, and at the same time that we make sure we have the conversation with the people that we need to talk to. We can and will win a referendum. We can and absolutely, I think, will succeed to deliver laws that significantly advance protections for women's human rights here in Ireland on that basis, if we do the work. We have a huge amount of work to do, but the turnout in this room this evening, at the very least, is just yet another indication of the appetite that people have to do that. Thanks very much.